My text is in the Gospel of John, and we will concentrate on chapter 4 in the Gospel of John. There is conflict in the Gospel of John almost from the beginning, or right from the beginning. Even in the prologue, there is an announcement that this is not going to be smooth sailing. But in the narrative of the Gospel, when you get to chapter 4, you see that some things are coming to a head, and we read in the beginning of chapter 4, and I would like you to read along with me, if you would do that, from verse 1, that Jesus, we're reading, Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard Jesus is making and baptizing more disciples than John. Now, this text tells us that the Pharisees are keeping tabs on what Jesus is doing, and the relationship is mutual. Jesus is also learning what they are, what sort of intelligence they are keeping on him. He also knows what they are thinking. So, to the Pharisees, of course, the growing impact of Jesus is not a good sign. It is not something they are welcoming. And Jesus is a bit apprehensive about their interest or their dislike of his impact. So he decides to retreat. He decides to pull back. And we read then on that Jesus left, because he is sensing hostility, he left Judea and started back to Galilee. And this takes me to the verse that is my first focus here, because John says in chapter 4, verse 4, that he says it like this: but he had to go through Samaria. But he had to go through Samaria. Now, the but there is a soft but. It is not a strong but in the Greek, but there is a but there. There is a kind of flag waving to us to slow down in the text, to see what is it that, what is John trying to tell us here. So he is in Judea, he is going to go to Samaria, and the text says, he's going to go to Galilee, and the text says that he had to go through Samaria. And my interest, our first interest here is what lies behind the notion that Jesus had to go through Samaria. And the easy answer, of course, and I hope you can see it here, the blue lines on my map here, that there is more than one blue line. Now, what would be the easy answer to the question, he had to go through Samaria? The easy answer is geography, isn't it? That there is a geographic reason. The road from Judea to Galilee goes through Samaria. That's the answer, isn't it? That is usually how we read this text, that the necessity of going through Samaria is a geographic necessity. That's why he had to go through Samaria. But if I could have the picture up again one more time, you will see here that there are 3 roads to Samaria. That you could go, 3 roads from Judea to Galilee. There is a Jordan Valley road, there is a coastal option, and then there is the option of going through Samaria. So the notion that the necessity here, that the notion of necessity is geographic, is not really the only possible option. There could be other options. And one option then is that there are other roads. And then there is also the fact that observant Jews at the time of Christ, they did not, when they traveled north-south or the other way, they would not go through Samaria. They would choose one of the other options, not wishing to be contaminated by contact with the Samaritans. And then there is a third option, And that is an option unique to the Gospel of John, because the Gospel of John does not like things to happen. It does not like Jesus to do things for reasons of circumstance, that this is something that is imposed on him by fact of circumstance. The Gospel of John, Jesus does things deliberately. He does it because it is something he is choosing to do, not because this is something the road or whatever circumstance makes him do. So we might have to find another explanation for the notion of necessity in our text, but he had to go through Samaria. So what other options do we have if geography is not the reason? What other options do we have then? And here is another suggestion, that Jesus has to go through Samaria, not because Samaria is on his way, but because Samaria is on his mind. He goes there on purpose, not by accident or not by force of circumstance. Instead, as our text says, he goes there by necessity, but the necessity is in him and not in something outside of him. It is not in circumstance. And then we move on in our text, now reading on in in chapter 4, verses 5 through 9. At high noon, to be exact, we do find Jesus in Samaria, realizing now, as my working hypothesis is, that Jesus is in Samaria for some other reason than that the road made him go there. So he came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. Now, it doesn't take long to read this text. It takes maybe less than a minute to read the whole thing that I just read. And we can read it even a shorter time if we take out some of the extraneous matters. So I would like us to do this text slowing it down somewhat, slowing it down and translating or transitioning it from narrative time to actual time. We won't have time to do actual time probably, but we will do a little bit of a compromise here. Narrative time. Narrative time is the time it takes to read a text like this. Actual time is the time that it took for the events that we are reading about to happen. And I am proposing that actual time is significantly longer than narrative time. So if you take out the extraneous matters, let's say you take out the historical information about the place, it was a well, there is Old Testament background, Jacob had dug the well, and so on, and the disciples had gone to the city to buy food, and there is some information about the relationship between Jews and Samaritans. They are not on speaking terms. If we take out all of those things and focus only on what transpires between Jesus and the woman, narrative time becomes even shorter. Narrative time is even just maybe 15 seconds. But do you think that this encounter between Jesus and the woman at the well took 15 seconds? None of us are likely to buy into that proposition. So we are going then to try to do do it in actual time. And we are in Samaria, and there is a woman coming. And let's just say that she comes to the well first. She is the first one to come there. And she comes here the usual way, in the usual manner, thinking that she will be alone at the well at high noon. Because as we know, there would be not, that is the reason why she goes at noon, because there is something fractured in her relationship with her community. So she comes to the well first with her bucket, and it is awkward. It is strange. It is like you don't really know what exactly to do, because here is the woman, and here is Jesus. I got this one wrong. I said that he comes to the well first. I said that she comes to the well first, but I should have said that he comes to the well first, and she comes and finds him there at the well. You would agree with me with that correction and with that reconstruction. So he is there, and she comes to the well, and it is awkward, and they don't exactly know what to say, and they are taking each other's measure, and there is a sort of fleeting eye contact between them, what to do. And then he asks her, please give me something to drink. And our text pauses, because this takes time. This takes a little time. What will she do? She will have to lower the bucket into the well. The well, we are told later, is deep. How deep was it? Anywhere from 40 to 80 meters deep. And it takes a while to lower the bucket into a well that is 40 to 80 meters deep. So she will do that, and that will take a few minutes. And then, what did he ask her? He asks her for a drink of water. And she gives him a drink of water. And he is thirsty. It has been a long, hot journey. He drinks the water, and he says, thank you. And there is, so our story has slowed down, and thank you very much. So already some minutes have passed. Already there has been some sort of interaction, some sort of, some transaction already that we would have missed if we had done this story only in narrative time. Choo. Very quickly we have moved to Jesus. He didn't even get his water before he starts talking about the living water. I think that is a faulty reconstruction, and that when we do it more in actual time, we see a different story. Jesus asking her for water, she getting him the water, he taking the cup and drinking the water, thanking her for the water. These are confidence-building measures. These are icebreakers. And surely there is something here that has happened already. There is a transaction going on between them. Three barriers have been overcome already in this first encounter between, or this first exchange between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. What are those three barriers? First, a Jew talks to a Samaritan. That is breach of the socio-ethnic barrier. That he overcomes that barrier. And there are surely socio-ethnic barriers in our world today. So Jesus has found a way to breach that barrier. A man talks to a woman. This is the gender barrier, and there is something to be said about that. And then there is what we might, if we accept the traditional way of reading this text, if we accept a traditional storyline on the Samaritan woman, which maybe we shouldn't, but we are going to do it today to not complicate the picture too much. If we accept the usual storyline, then there is an upright man, a pious man, talking to a less pious person, as it were, and that would be breach of the moral barrier. So 3 barriers overcome: the socio-ethnic barrier, the gender barrier, and here also a moral barrier, the barriers that uprightness might impose on us in our relations with other people. Now, I'll have to speed up the story from here, because we cannot do every point here in detail, so I will have to do to sort of compress it now that I just invited you to buy into the concept of narrative time, or actual time, and to sort of not be confined by just narrative time. Now I will violate my own principles on this point and compress the rest of the story. In verses 10 to 15, which you can look at in your Bibles, but I will not do in detail, there is a transition. Jesus has received his water, and now he is offering water, isn't he? He talks to the Samaritan woman. There is eye contact again. There is close eye contact. And he says to her, if you knew who is asking you for water, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. So he is starting to move from his need to her need. He is hypothesizing. He is postulating that she has a need, and there is that even she has some awareness, you might say, of her need. So he moves from his need to her need, and he has established trust. He has already, to some extent at least, won her confidence, so as to make that transition not seem overly threatening. Because when she responds to him, she says, well, she doesn't say, I have no need of water, I have no such need. She seems to be very intrigued by the offer Jesus holds out to her. So that's all we will have time to say about verses 10 to 15. And then in verses 16 to 18, we see a transition from what you might call the general to the specifics, from the sublime in the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John is very good at sublimity, very good at giving us sort of high, exalted, even abstract visions of what God offers. We see the Gospel of John transitioning from the sublime, living water, that's the sublime, to everyday reality. We see Jesus transitioning from the general to the particular. And so when they have talked a little here, he will say to her, and now we are firmly grounded in everyday reality, aren't we? Go and get your husband and bring him here. And that is quite a shocking transition, isn't it? That's quite unexpected. That must have been very unexpected from her. And she will say, I have no husband. And he will say, what will he say? You have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. And you could hear this in different ways, but what is he actually saying about the husband she has now? The husband you have now is not your husband. The husband you have now may be somebody else's husband. It could be that. It could be that. It could, at the very least, if we now stick with the traditional way of reading this text, it could at the very least be very uncomfortable. It could be that this is exactly the topic she has tried to avoid. This is exactly why she has been distanced, why she has been ostracized, or why she has been alienated from her community, so as to make her come there at high noon, all by herself, to get water, while the other people, while the community will be coming together, because going out to fetch water is a communal activity in the Middle East. It is a communal activity today, and it would have been a communal activity even in those days. This is a very daring move. This is a very daring move. This could be a conversation stopper. This could shut it down. But somehow Jesus must have established a kind of rapport with her to make this transition into the particularity of a life that hasn't quite gone as one had hoped. To make that transition not seem threatening, and she is even at this point coming alone. Now, let me risk a little bit of a rethink on this story, and I am not investing very much in this option, so don't hold it against me. Don't think that he really had some crazy idea about Jesus here, and you should not you should not take away completely my credibility by doing this little digression. How does Jesus know that she had had 5 husbands? How does Jesus do that? And you know that the Gospel of John does things with specificity, with a degree of specificity that you do not find in the synoptics. The synoptics do not go where the Gospel of John does. Gospel of John in chapter 5, the man had been sick for how many years? 38 years. Specifics. There was a gate there called the Sheep Gate. There was a pool there named Bethsatha. There are specifics. There are names and numbers in the Gospel of John. And now this person has had several husbands, 5 husbands. And you better get it right when you try stuff like that. It wasn't 5, it was 4, it was 3. 5 husbands. How does he know that? Well, again, the traditional answer would be Jesus knows it because he has supernatural sources of information. Wouldn't that be our usual thing? That the Holy Spirit whispered in his ear, this lady has had 5 husbands. And he takes, knowing that's how he does it. Now, could there be some other way of knowing that this lady has had 5 husbands other than by the Holy Spirit, other than by Jesus by God telling Jesus? Now, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? There seems to be some meaning to doing it if Jesus is to be our role model. If you are going to say, well, I want to do things the way Jesus did it, and then you sit in a conversation with somebody, and it would be to your advantage to know something about this person. Jesus knows that she has had 5 husbands. Could you have that kind of information? Could you and I, in our encounters with people, have that kind of information? What I am driving at would be an alternative scenario, that Jesus has gone through Samaria before. That is the road they traveled before. They have done this in the Gospel of John. He goes back and forth between Judea and Samaria all the time. In the Synoptics, maybe only once, maybe very little. There is not much traveling. But in the Gospel of John, it's up and down through this little country all the time. So maybe they had been there before. Like I said, don't buy this uncritically. but maybe they had been there before, and maybe he had seen her before, and maybe he had taken interest in her, and maybe he had inquired about her, and maybe her story was out there. That was a story talked about in Samaria, and they all knew that she had had 5 husbands, and they all knew that the husband she had now is not her husband. That kind of story. It was that kind of life. She was a significant person. She was, as it were, in the gossip columns. You could do that. Couldn't you do that? And if you do that, then Jesus' knowledge of her would be what? It would not be knowledge because he has supernatural sources of information. It would be because he has what? Superior powers of observation. Superior powers of observation. And you and I could do that. On that score, Jesus could be our role model on the level of taking an interest in an individual. So, you know, in our plot line, in what is my plot line here, that Jesus had to go through Samaria, there could be an antecedent of this kind. That's all I'm trying to do. So, but we're not ruling it out, of course, that Jesus knew this because the Holy Spirit told him. But I would be happier in some ways if it weren't that way, if it was that other way, because that would make it more like we would be more on the same level. So there is then, so let's just recap a little here. So we have transitioned from his need for water to her need for water, as it were. And we have transitioned, we have progressed from generalities, from the symbolic to the specific. And we have now seen that there is a progression. The third point here, there is a progression in her view of him, isn't there? And if we could look at this in the first point here, how can you, a Jew, speak to me, a woman of Samaria? That is to say, she sees Jesus from the beginning as an exceptional human being. She sees humanity there, exceptional humanity. And then the next thing, more progression, 4:12, are you greater than our father Jacob? Well, that is putting it way up there, isn't it? Are you greater than our founding father Jacob? Jesus as a great spiritual figure. And then when he has told her about the husbands, I see that you are a prophet. And by the way, prophets are not prophets only because they have superior sources of information. Prophets are often prophets in the Bible because they have superior powers of observation. They are primarily seers. They see things, and Jesus could be a great seer. And she means that when she says, I see that you are a prophet. And then she says a little later, I know that when the Messiah comes, or I know that when Messiah comes, he will tell us everything. And then she goes even further than that, because when she runs off into the village, into town, she tells them, come and see the man who told me everything I have ever done. He couldn't be the Messiah, could he? So you see the wonderful progression here. But it begins, and that is really maybe the most difficult point, to get it to begin, to get a relationship to begin. It begins on the level of humanity, in very common gestures, very common sort of touches between these two people. Now, just a little comment on verse 429. Come and see the man who told me everything I ever did. Now that is really something. I hope you never meet such a person who has told you I hope you never meet a person who can tell you about everything I ever did. I just wish that never to happen, because that would be very threatening. That would be really unnerving, wouldn't it? At least for some of us, that would be really unnerving. So, and for her, who seems to have had a complicated relational history, what you might call a toxic relational history. For her, or you might even say that there had been many defeats. Now, there could be other reasons why she had many husbands, of course. They could have died, they could have divorced her. There are other scenarios for that. But let's just say that she has had a series of illicit relationships. You know, you want people to meet the man who has sort of run through that part of your life story. Well, what has Jesus done? He has, of course, detoxified her relational history, hasn't he? He has, in some ways, it has been out there, and Jesus has gone over it. He has not made her feel awful about it. In fact, he has made her feel like something that was wrong can be made right. Something that was wrong, something that is troubling, that is undoing to a person, can be made right. And then, so we see this progression in her view of Jesus: a good human being, an exceptional human being, greater than our father Jacob, and then a prophet, maybe even the prophet that is mentioned in the prologue in the gospel, or not in the prologue, but in chapter 1 about John the Baptist. Are you the prophet? And so on. And then the Messiah. But how great is Jesus in the Gospel of John? Because you, the reader of the Gospel, knows more about Jesus than the actors within the Gospel, don't you? I mean, don't you? Aren't you? You are almost, as a reader of this Gospel, omniscient with respect to who Jesus is. You know more than her. Let's just read a statement here by Gail O'Day, who has written a wonderful book called The Revelation in the Fourth Gospel. She says that, but for the evangelist and for the reader who has moved through the Gospel with him, the encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman is not just an encounter between a Jew and a Samaritan. How is it that you, a Jew, can talk to me, a Samaritan? How is it for the evangelist does not ultimately arise because Jesus and Samaritans do not have relations with one another, but from the fact that the Jew who asks the woman for water is not just any Jew. He is the King of the Jews, the one in whose name we ask. Well, who is he? He is the King of the Jews. You can do even better than that. Who is Jesus in the Gospel of John? The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Jesus in the Gospel of John is the Logos incarnate, isn't he? That's who he is. And what sort of claims can we make on behalf of the person who has this encounter with the woman? He who has seen me has seen the Father. He who has seen me is the Father. That's how big he is. That's how great this encounter is. And he is then, in some ways, you and I know more than her, even though she knows plenty. And the consequences to her knowing it is really quite formidable. So, I am not sure how we are doing for time here. Can I have fine, good, thank you. We now need to make some points of application from this story. So we are leaving, to some extent, the story now and moving to to an attempt to do a couple of take-home comments on this encounter one-on-one with the woman of Samaria, or the answer to the question, why did Jesus have to go to Samaria? So my first point here will be, number one, that in the Gospel of John, ministry is local, personal, and individual. Ministry is local, personal, and individual. Well, what isn't it? What isn't it? You know, and I'm thinking today about church. We're talking, our theme is making God known in Europe. So how do we do it? Well, if we were to take the Gospel of John at face value only, the primary modus operandi will be what? It will be local, it will be individual, and it will be personal. It will not be, and I say this with all due respect, and I do not say this to disparage or to sort of close down ministries, as it were, but it will not be on television. You will not reach the woman of Samaria on TV. This is not an encounter that you could possibly conceive of or possibly script, or this same scenario, like you could have done it some other way. You could have done it on television. You cannot, because the ministry here is personal, it's local, it is individual. There is a close relationship between the theology of the Gospel of John and the missiology. The theology of the Gospel of John, what is it that saves a person in the Gospel of John? Is it the death of Jesus? Is it the resurrection of Jesus? Is it, what is it? What sort of formula for salvation do we have in the Gospel of John? I say we have no formula. There is absolutely no formula. There is a report, and the report says what? The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. That is the Gospel of John's notion of salvation. So what is salvation in the Gospel of John? It is incarnation. It is revelation in God known through the person of Jesus. The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. And it is the God dwelling among us who comes to Samaria and has his encounter with the woman of Samaria. My second point is that in this story, as in many stories in the Gospel of John, the role of women in ministry is so conspicuous, so as to make you wonder why churches through the ages, churches built to commemorate and to spread the good news of Jesus, why there has been such hand-wringing, such agonizing over the role of women in ministry. Here, Jesus talks to a woman who would seem to be conspicuously disqualified for that kind of attention. He gives her broad attention. He takes her question seriously. They discuss high points of theology. He, takes it into her personal life, and then he makes her, as it were, a minister. She becomes his conduit to the people of Samaria, doesn't she? And then you see also, because the Gospel of John doesn't teach us things in propositions. It teaches us things more in paradigms. So when the disciples come out after they have gone shopping, and Jesus is sitting there at the well, and I'm so glad we have this bench here so I can sit on it like Jesus at the well. And the disciples are coming back to him from their shopping trip in Samaria. To them, to the disciples, Samaria is a gas station where you fill petrol. It is a place where you buy a hamburger and move on. But to Jesus, Samaria is a place of vital interest to him. They come back. They see him talking to this woman that is sitting next to him at the well. And they say, what do they say, the disciples, the men in the story? They say, what is he seeking? Why is he talking to her? See, the incomprehension on their part of his interest in her. And she is his means of winning Samaria. For the men in the story, they say there is still 4 months unto harvest. And for Jesus, and in some ways for the Samaritan woman, the fields are ripe for harvest as we speak. My third point is that we must win, or Jesus will win a person's confidence before he will do anything else. We must win other human beings, other people's confidence before we can do anything else. And Jesus does it by listening, keen observer, learning about the particularities of that person's life, putting together 2 and 2, and so on. And I just again think this is not meant to disparage projects that are afoot in our church today, but it is meant to put things in perspective. It is fine to distribute the great controversy to households in Europe, but that is hardly the method in the Gospel of John. The method in the Gospel of John is what? You need to win people's confidence first, and you should not do anything before you have won people's confidence, and you should certainly not do something that might cost you people's confidence if that could happen. So again, winning people's confidence is really the name of the game here, the missiological strategy, you might say, of the Gospel of John. And then to my last point, the most important point, however, that's back to the question we began with at the beginning. Why must Jesus go to Samaria? Why must he do that? And I'm reading here from Stephen Moore, who has written an article on this, a wonderful article. So what drives Jesus to Samaria ultimately, then saying that it wasn't geography, is that he has a longing for her. Let's look at this quotation here from Stephen Moore. For many who have written on the scene at the Samaritan well, the woman's oblivion to her own need, assumed to be so much greater than that of Jesus, is the pivot on which the irony of their dialogue turns. Deeper by far, however, is the irony of Jesus' own need, not to mention the need of his Father, that need is just as great as the woman's. The well is deep, says the woman. Desire, however, is bottomless. We have in this story, haven't we? We have a story that moves from Jesus' need of water. Give me to drink. And she gives him water and meets his need. The story pivots to her need for him. And then, can you see it? That the story pivots back to what? To what? To his need for her. That is the desire in this story that is bottomless. The well is deep, but God's need for her is the bottomless need. Would you say with me as we end on my initial text, but he had to go through Samaria. Can we say that together? But he had to go through Samaria. Amen.